courtroom is quiet. It's the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something important is about to happen. The lawyer steps in, walking confidently toward the front. His suit is perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a shine. He moves with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of practice. He's been here before, many times. Today, though, it's just another easy case for him. He stands tall, ready to take on whatever comes next. In his mind, there's no way he can lose. The man across from him is no match for his skills. The homeless man. He looks out of place in the courtroom. His clothes are ragged, his hair unkempt, and his face is worn from the streets. The lawyer can't help but sneer. He knows this won't be a challenge. The homeless man stands there, looking small and fragile. He doesn't meet anyone's eyes. Instead, he stares down at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. The lawyer takes a deep breath, keeping his composure. But inside, he's already convinced he's won. He shifts in his seat and mutters a laugh, not loud enough to be heard, but just enough for those around him to notice. The sound of that laugh echoes in the still room. A few people glance at the homeless man, then at the lawyer. The man doesn't respond, his face expressionless. The judge sits at the bench, watching quietly. His eyes move between the lawyer and the man. He doesn't say anything yet. The lawyer stands, ready to begin. His confidence fills the room. He knows the outcome. He's seen it all before. This will be easy. The judge gives the signal, and the homeless man is called to speak. He slowly rises from his seat, his legs shaky. He's not used to standing for long, and it shows. But he doesn't look nervous, just tired. He takes a deep breath and begins. His voice is soft at first, almost a whisper. It cracks a little as though it hasn't been used much lately. But as he speaks, the words grow clearer. I wasn't always like this, he says, his voice steadying. I had a life once. I was someone important. The lawyer rolls his eyes, clearly uninterested. He leans back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk forming at the corners of his lips. He's heard stories like this before. They always end the same way. It's just another sob story. But the homeless man continues, ignoring the lawyer's dismissive attitude. I used to have a family, a wife, kids. I was a businessman, running a successful company. I thought I had it all. His eyes look distant now, as if he's reliving those days. The courtroom is quiet. People are starting to listen more closely. The man's story doesn't sound like a typical tale of failure. It's different. But then, everything changed, he says, his voice breaking slightly. One night, I lost everything. My family, my wealth, my life as I knew it. All gone in an instant. He pauses, looking down at the floor. For a moment, it seems like he's gathering himself. The room feels heavy with his silence. I didn't know how to handle it, he continues. I didn't want anyone to pity me, so I walked away from it all. I chose the streets. I thought it would be easier that way. The lawyer taps his pen against the desk, clearly growing impatient. He's heard enough. In his mind, it's just another attempt to play on people's emotions. But the man isn't done yet. His next words are quiet but firm. I don't want your sympathy. I just want to be treated with respect. I may be homeless, but I'm still a person. His gaze finally lifts, and for the first time his eyes meet the lawyer's. There's no anger in them, just an unwavering calm. The lawyer doesn't know how to react. He's still convinced he'll win, but for some reason, the man's words stick in his mind. The room remains still as the homeless man finishes speaking. He returns to his seat, his shoulders slightly slumped, but there's a quiet dignity in his posture. He doesn't look at anyone else. He doesn't need to. The lawyer sits forward, ready to tear apart the story. But something about it doesn't sit right with him. The silence in the courtroom is thick. The homeless man has finished speaking, and yet, the room feels heavy with the weight of his words. But the lawyer doesn't pause. He's already thinking about his next move. His confidence is unshaken. He stands up with a flourish, straightening his suit as he walks toward the front. His shoes click sharply against the floor, a sound that seems to echo in the quiet room. He pauses, then looks down at the homeless man, his lips curling into a smug smile. Well, the lawyer says, voice dripping with sarcasm, I think we've all heard enough, haven't we? He chuckles, almost as if the man's story is some sort of joke. A businessman, huh? I'm sure that's a very touching story. But it's clear that what we have here is a man who simply didn't know how to handle his problems. The lawyer gestures vaguely toward the homeless man. He lost everything, sure, but it's his own fault. He could have fought harder. He could have done something. Instead, he chose the streets. He chose to give up. A few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge raises an eyebrow but remains silent, waiting for the lawyer to continue. The homeless man says nothing. He doesn't even look up. The lawyer continues, his tone growing more mocking. I mean, who wouldn't respect a man who walks away from it all? Who needs family or wealth when you can just disappear into the streets, right? He laughs, but it's not a friendly sound. It's loud, harsh, and without kindness. The courtroom watches, some of the people exchanging glances. They're uncomfortable, but the lawyer doesn't seem to notice, or maybe he doesn't care. Look at him, the lawyer says, as if speaking to the whole room. A man who had everything and threw it away. A man who doesn't even care enough to pull himself together. It's pathetic, really. The judge's gaze sharpens, but he doesn't speak. The lawyer's arrogance fills the room, and he doesn't seem to notice how it's making everyone uncomfortable. He stands there, looking down at the homeless man with a sense of superiority. The homeless man, though, remains calm. His eyes are still on the floor. He hasn't said a word. Hasn't reacted to the lawyer's insults. His silence only makes the lawyer more determined to tear him apart. But even as the lawyer continues, something is starting to change. The words are coming out too easily now, too harshly. The confidence he felt earlier is beginning to feel empty. He doesn't know it yet, but something is shifting in the courtroom, something that will soon make him question everything he thought he knew. The lawyer continues, clearly enjoying his moment of mockery. His voice grows louder, more confident with every word. He's sure he's winning. But then, unexpectedly, the judge raises his hand. The courtroom falls into complete silence. The lawyer looks up, a little surprised. The judge's expression is calm, but there's something different in his eyes. It's not the kind of look that signals approval. No, this is something else. The judge clears his throat, his voice steady as he speaks. Mr. Parker, the judge says, addressing the lawyer. Are you familiar with the real identity of the man sitting before you? The question hangs in the air, and for a moment, the lawyer doesn't understand. He glances at the judge, then back at the homeless man, who is still sitting quietly, his head lowered. The lawyer lets out a small laugh, thinking the judge is joking. What are you talking about, Your Honor? He responds, his voice dripping with disbelief. This is a homeless man, a guy who's obviously lost it all. He's just a street dweller. The judge doesn't smile. His face remains stern, and the courtroom feels colder now. He leans forward slightly, locking eyes with the lawyer. I would suggest, Mr. Parker, that you check your facts before you continue. The lawyer frowns, feeling a little uneasy. He glances back at the homeless man, his confidence beginning to waver. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I still don't. The judge interrupts, his voice firm. This man, the one you've been mocking so freely, is not just any homeless person. He's someone you should have recognized. The lawyer stares, his mind racing, but the words don't make sense to him. The homeless man? Someone important? It's impossible. The judge continues. The man before you is none other than Richard Hayes, former CEO of Hayes Enterprises. The name hits the room like a shockwave. The air feels thick with disbelief. The lawyer's mouth goes dry. He's heard the name before, of course. Hayes Enterprises was a massive company, a giant in the industry. Everyone knew Richard Hayes. Everyone respected him. But the man sitting in front of him? This ragged figure with a face full of hardship and a quiet demeanor? The lawyer can hardly believe it. Richard Hayes, once a wealthy businessman, a leader of industry, a man who could have anything he wanted, now reduced to this. The lawyer's face pales as the truth begins to sink in. You're mistaken. The lawyer stammers, his voice cracking slightly. That's impossible. He can't be. The judge leans back in his chair, his expression unchanged. It is, in fact, very possible. Mr. Hayes lost everything in a tragic accident. A series of events left him without his fortune, his family, his life as he knew it. But he chose to live this way, without anyone knowing his identity. The courtroom is silent now. The lawyer's mind spins. He's still trying to make sense of it, but the weight of the words hits him hard. The homeless man, Richard Hayes, never wanted sympathy. He wanted to disappear, to be treated like anyone else. And now the lawyer understands. The man he had mocked, belittled, and looked down on, had been someone far greater than he could have ever imagined. He had no idea. The homeless man doesn't speak. He simply sits there, looking straight ahead, his face a mixture of calm and sorrow. He's not angry, he's not upset. He's just resigned, and in that moment, the lawyer feels small. His arrogance has evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a deep sense of shame. The courtroom remains quiet, the weight of the revelation hanging heavily in the air. The lawyer's heart is racing. He feels his face flush with embarrassment, his previous mockery now echoing in his mind like a haunting memory. The judge clears his throat again, breaking the silence. Mr. Hayes lost his wealth, yes, but what he lost more than anything was his family, his wife, his children. They were all taken from him after a terrible accident. The lawyer tries to process what he's hearing. His mind is spinning, still struggling to reconcile the man in front of him with the powerful CEO he's just learned about. Richard Hayes, the man he had dismissed so easily, had once had it all. But it wasn't just his business empire that he lost. The pain in his voice, the sorrow that echoed in his eyes during his testimony, made it clear now that this wasn't just about money. This was about a man who had everything ripped away from him in the cruelest way possible. The judge continues, his voice softer now. After the accident, Mr. Hayes didn't want to be found. He couldn't bear to face the world, not after everything he'd lost. He chose to disappear, to live without anyone knowing who he really was. The lawyer's gaze shifts to the homeless man, still sitting there, calm and composed despite everything. There's a quiet dignity about him, something the lawyer hadn't seen before. He had thought he understood people like him, those who ended up on the streets. In his mind, they were failures. But now he was starting to see the bigger picture. I had no idea, the lawyer mutters, more to himself than anyone else. He doesn't know how to feel. He can't look at Richard Hayes the way he had before. He can't pretend the man in front of him is the same person he had mocked moments ago. Richard Hayes doesn't look up. He doesn't respond to the judge's words or the lawyer's soft-spoken confession. It's as if he's accepted everything that's happened to him. The man who had once been at the top of the world, running a company and enjoying the life of luxury, was now sitting quietly in a courtroom, stripped of all pretense. The lawyer wants to apologize. He wants to tell Mr. Hayes how sorry he is for laughing at him, for mocking his struggles. But he knows it wouldn't be enough. Words wouldn't change what had just happened. And more than that, he knows the man doesn't need his pity. There's a heavy silence, but this time, it's different. It's no longer uncomfortable, in the same way it had been before. The lawyer's arrogance has crumbled, replaced by a deep, gnawing regret. He sees now that he was the one who had failed, to see beyond his assumptions, to understand the true story behind the face in front of him. The judge looks at both men, then leans back in his chair. You can go now, Mr. Hayes. The case is settled. Richard Hayes stands slowly, his movements deliberate but not weak. As he turns to leave, he gives the lawyer one last look, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that makes the lawyer feel smaller than he's ever felt before. The homeless man, once a towering figure of success, now leaves the courtroom just as quietly as he entered, an invisible presence, yet somehow more real than anyone else in the room. As Richard Hayes walks out of the courtroom, the lawyer remains seated, frozen. He can't move, can't think straight. His mind is still trying to process everything he's just learned. The weight of his earlier words feels suffocating now. He had laughed, mocked, and judged a man whose life had been destroyed in ways he couldn't even imagine. The arrogance that had once fueled him now feels hollow, and the self-assurance he'd walked in with has vanished. The lawyer looks around the courtroom. The judge has already turned his attention back to the papers in front of him, as if nothing out of the ordinary has happened. But the lawyer knows it's different. He feels it in his chest, this strange, uncomfortable heaviness that won't go away. He glances at the other people in the courtroom, but no one meets his gaze. They're all quietly processing the same thing. The lawyer is no longer the man they thought he was. His reputation, built on success and quick wins, feels like a distant memory. He stands up slowly, his legs shaky. His mind races with questions, about the homeless man, about himself. about how easy it had been to judge someone based on their appearance, their situation, without ever knowing their story. The truth has hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He walks out of the courtroom, but he feels lost. His steps are heavy, and his thoughts are scattered. He can't stop thinking about Richard Hayes, the man he had laughed at, the man he had looked down on. As he exits the building, the cool air hits his face, but it doesn't clear his head. It doesn't change the way he feels. He had assumed the worst about someone he'd never even bothered to understand. He had based his entire judgment on a few details, what he saw on the surface. But now, the picture is clearer. The homeless man was not a failure. He was someone who had been shattered by life's cruelest turns, someone who had once stood tall, but had been knocked down harder than anyone could imagine. The lawyer looks at his reflection in the glass doors of the courthouse. For the first time, he doesn't see the confident, arrogant man he once was. Instead, he sees someone who's learned a painful but necessary lesson. He sees someone who now understands the importance of compassion, of looking beyond the surface, of not judging someone based on their circumstances. He feels the weight of the moment settle in. The realization is hard to swallow, but it's also a wake-up call. The lawyer knows he will never be the same again. From this point forward, he will approach people differently. He will listen more, assume less, and remember that every person has a story he's not always going to be able to see at first glance. He turns and walks away from the courthouse, the memory of Richard Hayes still fresh in his mind. He knows that, no matter what, this moment will stay with him forever.